So my focus on this panel is on the human rights implications of TTIP. Now, traditionally, trade and investment policies have been measured in terms of net economic benefits and market-based criteria. And there has been a tendency to ignore or even discount the societal effects that a liberalized trade or investment regime may cause. But in many ways, there's a natural connection between trade and investment and human rights. So you can see that many of these types of agreements, the objectives of the treaties include things like raising standards of living or improving working conditions or fulfilling the objectives of sustainable development. The EU's trade policy even talks about the fact that trade openness should be an important lever to lifting poverty. So insofar that the protection of human rights is integral to achieving these objectives, one would think that the human rights implications of trade and investment agreements must be addressed. We've also seen many examples of the potential negative impacts that trade and investment rules can have on human rights. So for example, in the EC hormones decision, it involved allegations of the use of hormones imported in beef from Canada and the US. And it was actually found that the presence of hormones increased the incidence of breast cancer in women, and yet these products were still allowed to come in. In the Piero Foresti case, there was an example of Italian investors suing the South African government for mining measures that the government had put into place to address the reparations of apartheid. And most recently, in the tobacco plain packaging cases that Mr. Dabazi alluded to earlier, tobacco giant Philip Morris was suing Australia and is currently suing Uruguay for measures that the governments have put into place relating to plain packaging. And these are measures which, of course, are designed to reduce the incidence of smoking. So these cases highlight the difficulties that states face in protecting human rights in the face of their trade and investment obligations. But these cases have also taught us that trade and investment do not operate in isolation from human rights issues, and that treaties must work better to bridge these seemingly opposable issue areas. But in fact, unlike the older generation of trade and investment agreements, the EU's proposed TTIP text actually does make a concerted effort at seemingly addressing non-economic rights in a number of areas of the agreement. That being said, human rights actually doesn't make any appearance in the TTIP agreement altogether. Instead, it seems to be subsumed under other headings or under wording. So for example, in the Sustainable Development chapter of the agreement, one could argue that human rights could be included under the general heading of sustainable development, which does have a social element. So for example, states are required to formulate policies on sustainable development goals, encourage businesses to develop and implement practices on sustainable development goals, and promote public consultation and participation on these issues. And the right for state parties to determine their own sustainable development policies and priorities is also recognized in the agreement. There's also no mention of human rights in TTIP's investment chapter. Instead, one could argue that they are included under the term social protection. So for example, investment obligations cannot alter state parties' right to regulate for social protection and non-discriminatory measures which are designed to protect legitimate public welfare objectives, such as social protection, are specifically defined not to be considered an indirect expropriation. And finally, we don't see human rights in the services chapter of the agreement as well. However, as Professor House alluded to, there's a general carve-out in the agreement that's similar to GATT Article 20, which talks about the fact that state parties are exempted from several state service obligations if it is necessary to protect legitimate public objectives, such as public security, public morals, or to maintain public order. So these provisions would likely be the closest objectives which could be used to encapsulate human rights issues, although in doing so, there may be a tendency to push a square peg through a round hole. And finally, one of the areas where there are mention of human rights would be in relation to labor rights. And in fact, the TTIP actually makes a lot of effort to address labor rights in a number of different ways. Although, as we've heard from my fellow panelists, these are not measures that are designed to change anything in any sort of way. And in fact, they remind me of a quote that my professor often used to say to me, these are Billy Baldwin provisions, cute, but basically completely irrelevant. Nevertheless, the agreement does make some efforts here. So they say that state parties should uphold the parties' labor protection objectives in a context of more liberalized trade. State parties are allowed to set their own levels of domestic labor protection, and they are allowed to exercise their right to regulate as long as it's not inconsistent with international labor standards and agreements. But the agreement doesn't actually impose any new obligations. Instead, they simply require that the state parties adhere to the core labor obligations under the ILO. That being said, for the EU, this is nothing new because they are already party to the core labor obligations, but they might be new for the US because they've only ratified 2 of the 8 fundamental ILO conventions. TTIP also talks about the importance of labor rights by requiring state parties to protect health and safety at work or decent working conditions for all. And reference is also made to a minimum living wage, but there's no actual specific obligation that state parties should implement such a wage. There's also reference to the need for a system of labor inspections to ensure enforcement of labor laws, which sounds like a great provision. But again, parties do not bear any specific obligations to implement such a practice. Another human right that is specifically referenced in the agreement would be the right to health. And this is found mainly in the Sustainable Development chapter as part of environmental practices. So for example, state parties commit to trade in environmentally sound management of chemicals so as to prevent or minimize adverse effects on human health. The recognition of the right to health is also found in the TTIP's investment chapter. So investment obligations are not allowed to affect the right of the parties to regulate for measures that are necessary to protect public health, and public health regulations are not to be considered indirect appropriations. There's also the carve out in the services chapter, which I talked about before, which allows parties to be exempt from certain obligations for reasons necessary to protect human health. Now, one of the areas which I find most surprising that is actually specifically mentioned in the TTIP agreement is that of gender equality. So this is a relatively interesting development given that trade and investment agreements have traditionally not made any references at all to gender, despite women often being the class of individuals that could be considered to be the losers in liberalization due to their often already disadvantaged status. So for example, in the Sustainable Development chapter, the recognition of gender equality is mentioned, but it's tied into other labor provisions. So for example, in relation to employment, state parties are obliged to uphold the promotion of gender equality, as well as the right to equal remuneration between men and women. And they're also supposed to exchange information and cooperate on worldwide elimination of discrimination in employment and the promotion of gender equality. Gender is also actually specifically referenced in the investment chapter as a ground under which an investor can bring a fair and equitable claim if the state party enacts a measure which discriminates on the basis of gender. Now, just like the labor provisions, while there are a number of references to gender, the actual impact on gender equality is likely to be low. Now, the provisions addressing gender are phrased relatively broadly, and they require the state parties only to maintain gender equality policies or exchange information, and only in relation to employment. And the only instance in which gender is specifically referenced in the investment context, it is used as a ground for an investor to be able to argue a violation of the fair and equitable standard. Now, given that the disproportionate number of women who have traditionally lost out in the liberalization process are usually not investors, it's probably likely that the recognition of gender equality in the investment chapter is not going to help very many women. Now, while the TTIP is considerably more advanced than we've seen in previous agreements, in at least attempting to take into account human rights, by specifically making some references under some conditions, I would say likely the greatest threat to human rights in the TTIP agreement remains in the continued use of the investor-state dispute settlement mechanism. So although TTIP does introduce this new concept of an international investment court, at its heart, it retains the very essence of ISDS, which is allowing foreign investors to challenge host state measures, even if those state measures are designed to protect its citizens' human rights. So in instances of differences of equality in judicial settlement mechanisms, such as between maybe a developed country and a developing country, I would agree that it makes considered sense to continue to use an international dispute resolution mechanism to protect foreign investors' rights. But the EU and the US both possess quality judicial mechanisms. So national bodies could likely offer the same quality of dispute settlement as an international court, but they would have greater awareness of the need to balance property rights with those of human rights. So in short, if TTIP was actually serious about the need to protect the state's right to regulate, which basically proliferates all of their documents in this area, particularly in relation to human rights goals, then the best step that the EU could have taken was to remove ISDS, or its new brother, the International Investment Court, from the agreement altogether. Thank you.